Okay, so let's go back to July 20th, 1969. Humanity does something that honestly feels like it's straight out of science fiction. We walked on the moon. I mean, what a moment, right? It was broadcast live, the whole world was watching, and yet, in all the years since, there's been this nagging question that just won't go away. Did it really happen? So, today, we're going to do more than just look at history. We're going to dive right into this fascinating battle over the nature of truth itself.
You have to understand, the moon landing wasn't just some tech demo. It was a massive cultural shockwave. I mean, it was so big that even serious historians like Hayden White, guys whose whole job is to put things into context, were kind of struggling for words. He actually put it in the same category as atomic weapons or genetic engineering, these huge world-changing events that felt, for all intents and purposes, like miracles. It just completely shattered what people thought was even possible.
And that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? If this thing was so huge, so widely seen, how in the world does a counterstory, the idea that it was all a big fake, even get started, let alone stick around for over 50 years? Well, the answer is kind of complicated, and it has a lot more to do with how we think about history than you might expect.
To really get to the bottom of this, we've got to start with a pretty fundamental idea. History isn't just a list of stuff that happened. Nope, it's a story. It's a construction. And that right there is where things start to get really interesting.
This right here is a really crucial distinction from historian Hayden White. Let me break it down. An event is just the raw data. A boot touches some dust. That's it. But a fact, now that's different. That's when we grab that event, we shine a spotlight on it, and we weave it into a bigger story. So a boot touches dust becomes Neil Armstrong, an American astronaut, is the first human to walk on the moon, marking a major victory in the space race. See the difference? This whole process of turning events into a story is called emplotment. It's a powerful idea because it reminds us that every piece of history we learn is, at its core, a constructed story.
And that leads us to this really cool concept from the philosopher Jacques Derrida, something he called artifactuality. The moon landing is the perfect example of this. Think about it. Most historical events, like the Battle of Hastings or something, people found out about way after the fact. But the moon landing, we experienced it through television. For millions and millions of people, the fuzzy black and white broadcast was the event. The real thing and the media version of it were totally inseparable from the very first second. And that blurriness is exactly what opens the door for people to reinterpret it or even say it never happened at all.
Okay, so if the official history is a story, how do you build a competing story that's strong enough to challenge it? Well, it's not just random accusations. There's actually a playbook for this stuff, a method that gets used over and over again to create doubt about things that are well-established science.
So, a researcher named Sven Hansen actually broke this down. He identified these 4 key moves, and it's like a recipe for doubt. First up, you cherry pick. You only grab the little bits of evidence that seem to support your case. Second, you neglect, which is a nice way of saying you totally ignore all the mountains of evidence that prove you wrong. Third, you fabricate fake controversies. This one's clever. You make it look like scientists are all arguing about it when they're really not. And last, you create what Hansen calls deviant criteria of assessment. Basically, you demand an impossible level of proof that no one could ever meet. Okay, you got the playbook? Let's see how it's used in the real world.
All right, now for the fun part. We can actually take some of the most famous moon hoax claims and see exactly how they plug right into this 4-part playbook. It's almost like having a decoder ring for this kind of stuff.
Ah, a classic. You've probably heard this one. The argument goes like this. Space is black, space is full of stars, so the pictures taken on the moon should be packed with stars, but they're not. So it must have been a studio, right? On the surface, it sounds like a good point, but it's a perfect example of that 4th trait from our playbook.
This is deviant criteria of assessment in action. The claim is setting up a totally impossible standard for a camera. It's asking for a single photograph to properly expose 2 completely different things at once: the super bright sun-blasted surface of the moon and the incredibly faint light from distant stars. Any photographer can tell you that's just not how cameras work. To get a good picture of the astronauts and the lander, they had to use a really fast shutter speed, which was way too fast to ever pick up the light from those dim stars.
Okay, here's another big one. If you look at the Apollo photos, the shadows cast by the astronauts and the rocks and everything else don't always seem to be parallel. So, the claim is, this proves there must have been multiple light sources, like big studio lights on a set.
This is a textbook example of cherry picking. You're focusing on one tiny detail, the shadows, and you're completely ignoring the most important piece of context, the ground itself. The moon isn't a perfectly flat studio floor. It's lumpy, it's got craters, little hills, and slopes everywhere. So when you have an uneven surface like that, plus the normal rules of perspective, shadows from a single light source way off in the distance, the sun, are absolutely going to look like they're going in different directions.
Now this one sounds really convincing at first. The engine on that lunar lander had 10,000 pounds of thrust. So shouldn't it have blown a massive crater into the moon dust when it landed? The fact that the ground underneath it looks pretty undisturbed, well, that must mean it was just gently placed there by a crane on a movie set.
And here we have a classic case of neglect of refuting information. There are a few key facts this claim just completely ignores. First, that 10,000-pound thrust was throttled way, way down for the final landing, especially in the moon's weak gravity. Second, they actually cut the engine a few feet before they touched down, so it just coasted the last little bit. And maybe most importantly, the moon's soil isn't like fine, fluffy powder. It's a stuff called regolith, and it's been bombarded by micrometeoroids for billions of years, so it's really dense and compacted, almost like wet sand. There just wasn't enough force to blow a big hole in it.
So we've picked apart some of the biggest claims. But the real question is, why does any of this matter today? I mean, who cares about a conspiracy theory that's over 50 years old? Well, it matters because the playbook used to create it is being used right now, more than ever. Look, the moon landing hoax doesn't stick around because there's a lack of proof that we went. It sticks around because it taps into a much deeper feeling of distrust in authority and official stories. It gives people a simple answer in a really complicated world. And understanding that is so important because the exact same playbook, the cherry picking, the fake controversies, it's being used everywhere, on everything from climate change to public health. So what's the big takeaway here? Well, first, just remember that history is always a story. It's never just a raw recording of events. Second, keep that 4-step science denial playbook in your back pocket. Cherry picking, ignoring facts, faking debate, and demanding impossible proof. It gives you a great toolkit for spotting this stuff out in the wild. And finally, it's not enough to just debunk the claim. You have to ask why. Why is that counter story so appealing to people in the first place?
In the end, this was never really just about the moon. It's about how we find our way in a world that is just flooded with information and misinformation and all kinds of competing stories. The fight for what's true is happening every single day, and the tools we bring to that fight matter more than ever. So the question is, what tools are you going to use?